Good morning, all. Our group will be focusing on the French poetic and theorist Stéphane Mallarmé, who is one of the key figures in modern poetry development. His work is a break with older poetic forms and their direct description and obvious narrative meanings. Mallarmé believed that poetry amply and not describe his critical writing. Crisis in Verse is where he declares this. Stephen Mallarmé, 1842 1898, was a translator, poet, and a French literary theorist who had a big influence on literature during the late 19th century. Despite a rather small number of publications in his lifetime, he emerged as a figurehead of French modernism because of the radical ideas on the role of language and poetic forms, as well as the role of art itself. Now, his importance. The first one I will look at, intellectual importance. The significance of Mallarmé is based mostly on the following three contributions. One, reinvented the idea of poetic language, and that is in his belief that poetry does not convey ideas in a straightforward way, but instead provides a clean space of language in which meaning is implied and not told. Another one, major movements that influence them, and they talk about symbolism. Third, brave confidential referential meaning. That is, asserting that language is not merely an expression of the world, but it alters it. Now I'm going to go straight into the summary of the main arguments in Crisis in Verse. Crisis in Verse deals with one of the most radical changes in poetry, brought about by the collapse of traditional language. Mallarmé argues the language of common people is no longer particles enough to show the level and the mystery of the world. Poetry has to renounce all reference in ordinary language and establish its own independent system. The important principle of Mallarmé is suggestion. Objects should not name directly in poetry, but ought to be brought into being sideways together in symbolic response. His well-known remark sums this opinion. To name an object is to suppress three-quarters of the pleasure of the poem. The autonomy of language. Mallarmé suggests that poetry is a language art. The musical meaning of words is not realized by reference, but through the musical relation of songs of words, by the spacing, silence, and rhythm. He argues that it is not the words that refer to external reality that gain power, but rather through interaction with each other. Poetry is pure language, that is, self-sufficient, self-generated, and profoundly structured language. This separates poetry out of narration, religious, or depiction. And the last one, the role of the poet. Mallarmé claims that the poet does not convey messages. The task of the poet is to show the inner world of words, to play words like a musician. Poetry is a process of word making and not word reflexive. My other colleague will take over. Thank you.
I'll be focusing on the second part of the assignment, how it connects to what we have done previously during this semester. In this semester, we have studied the Romanticism, the painter of modern life, and much more. These taught us how literature have changed over time and how the language used can shape meaning and also the way poetry is framed. In this presentation today, I'll be making connections with our group's text, Stephen Mallarmé, to the other texts we have covered during this semester. The text by Stephen Mallarmé speaks of a change literature is going through, not just any change, but rather an exquisite change. His words are, literature is here undergoing an exquisite and fundamental crisis. It shows us literature is consistently changing, moving from traditional poetic forms. This is strongly connected to William's word preface. that poetry must be by moving away from artificial language to his word. And his words are the real language of men. The two writers acknowledge the breakpoint of literature when inherited forms are no longer enough. Wordsworth's crisis is to leave the 18th century poetic convention and change to an emotional truth, what a man really thinks, which is described by him as men's language. Additionally, in the text Crisis of Verse by Mallarmé tells us that when verse loosens and it moves away from its traditional form, it still has to follow a rhythm that gives it meaning. This prosody, which its brief rule is nevertheless compromising, this is connected to Baudelaire's of the painter of modern life. He says that art of modern time must capture the fleeting impression, but must do so through the style and the rhythm which is symbolic. In the two writing, we can see that literature slash art cannot have a freedom of structure because it has to follow a rhythm. As Mallarmé poetry, it depends greatly on prosody, and Baudelaire's work on painting on the rhythm and style. In both cases, the accommodation of freedom and form is what makes literature go beyond basic description and provides its meaning. Moreover, Mallarmé says a good poetry work well through the evocation. The description, rhythm, and musical feature exceeds the voice of the poet. Words can take center echoing, reflections like a virtual swooping of fire across precious stone. This makes the poem feel timeless and more universal. This can be linked to John Keats' letter on negative capability. He said the greatest writers are the ones capable of being able to place readers in uncertainty without forcing explanation after the fact. Both writers place emphasis on what poetry should be about. It should never have an aim to explain, but rather suggest and allow beauty to be in imagination, which will emerge through rhythm. I will now hand you over to my next colleague.
Good morning, everyone. I will be looking at any new directions or arguments put forward by Mallarmé compared to other poets that we would have studied. To name an object is to express reports of the enjoyment of the poem, which is made up of gradual discovery. To suggest it, that is the dream, said Mallarmé. This French symbolist poet, whose impact on contemporary art has influenced modern art and literature is profound, has put forward new directions and arguments compared to poets we would have studied in this semester, moving away from the conventional poetic norms compared to other poets. Plato and Aristotle viewed their poetry as a representation of the truth, imitation, and moral instructions. The classical foundation of poetry adheres to the established rules, prioritizing clarity and harmony. Their poetry presented a specific purpose, in contrast to Mallarmé, who believed that poetry should be ambiguous, forming itself without structure and rules. Mallarmé believed that poems should be ambiguous, evolving independently rather than a rigid structure and regulations. Mallarmé advocated for poetry to convey multiple meanings rather than a single explicit one. Compared to Horace poetry, which emphasized clarity and moral guidance, he believed that poetry should center around human experience, set by rules and emotions. Horace's injunction that poetry should both instruct and delight has been repeated so often that it has come to known as the Horatian platitude. He believed that art should be fun while teaching a valuable lesson. Mallarmé represents the opposite of Thoreau's. It is believed that poetry should be mysterious and have infinite meaning rather than being straightforward. In conclusion, Stefan Mallarmé, Crisis and Verse highlights the important time of change in modern poetry, challenging the traditional ideas and forms. He embraced suggestions and rhythm and redefined poetry as being self-sufficient as classical and romantic poets did. Thank you. That brings us to the end of our presentation.